Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fact Check, Simplified. Today, we're talking about that time when the entire global economy got held hostage by microscopic switches etched onto tiny pieces of silicon. The great chip shortage, think of it as the world's worst startup pitch meeting gone global, where automakers, tech giants, and refrigerator manufacturers all showed up demanding the same limited resource. And the universe just replied, sorry, we're experiencing higher than normal call volumes. We're going to oversimplify this glorious, interconnected mess of corporate greed, consumer panic, and geopolitical posturing until it makes a sick kind of sense. Because honestly, if you try to understand it any other way, you'll need a flowchart the size of Texas and a PhD in whatever soul-crushing science is called economics before the inevitable corporate betrayal starts. If you enjoy this highly dramatic but fun version of modern facts, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us pay the electric bill for our overpriced standing desks. It's the digital equivalent of an applause sign, and my fragile ego needs it. All right, grab an iced latte. Things are about to get unnecessarily infuriating. Let's set the scene. The year is 2019. Remember 2019? It was a chaotic but blissfully ignorant era. We were all just going about our lives, buying shiny new things, confident that if we clicked a button, a miracle of global logistics would deposit our desired dopamine hit on our doorstep. Within 2 business days, the world ran on an invisible, unspoken promise. The stuff would always be there. New phones would launch every September like clockwork. Car lots were overflowing with choices. You could walk into a store and buy a video game console without having to enter a lottery, sell a kidney, or win a gladiatorial combat match on a live stream. It was a golden age of consumerism, and we didn't even know it. The entire engine of this modern paradise was humming along thanks to a philosophy that every MBA program had been worshipping for decades. Just-in-time manufacturing. JIT. It sounded so efficient, so sleek, so optimized. The idea was pure, uncut corporate genius. Why waste money on massive warehouses filled with parts you might need eventually? That's inefficient. Instead, you build a supply chain so perfectly synchronized, so breathtakingly precise, that the necessary components, screws, chassis, processors, you name it, arrive at the factory just in time to be slotted into the product rolling down the assembly line. No waste, no inventory, maximum profit. It was a beautiful, intricate ballet of cargo ships, freight trains, and delivery trucks, all moving in perfect harmony. It was also, and this is the important part, a system built with the structural integrity of a house of cards in a hurricane. This hyper-efficient model had systematically eliminated every single buffer, every safety net, every ounce of slack. It was designed for a perfect world where nothing ever went wrong. No global pandemics, no freak weather events, no sudden geopolitical tantrums, no container ships getting stuck sideways in a canal. The entire global economy had become a high-wire artist performing without a net. Because nets are expensive and don't look good on a quarterly earnings report, everyone just assumed the tightrope was infinitely long and the air was perfectly still. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. And what were the most important parts being juggled in this insane circus act? Semiconductors. Chips. The microscopic brains inside literally everything you own that plugs into a wall or has a battery. Your phone, your laptop, your TV, that's obvious, but also your car, not just the fancy touchscreen, but the systems that control your engine, your brakes, your airbags, your power windows. That's hundreds, sometimes thousands, of chips per vehicle. They're in your ridiculously expensive refrigerator that can order more milk. They're in your washing machine, your microwave, your electric toothbrush. They are the invisible, unthanked serfs of the 21st century. A digital nervous system running a civilization that had completely forgotten they even existed. And here's the kicker. Nobody was worried. Not consumers, not corporations, not even most governments. A chip shortage seemed as likely as an oxygen shortage. The supply chain was a solved problem, a utility that just worked. Companies based their entire multi-trillion-dollar business models on the assumption that they could order any quantity of these magical silicon wafers whenever they wanted, and they would simply appear. The flow was constant and infinite. It was the foundational belief upon which all modern industry was built. This blissful ignorance was the precondition for the absolute catastrophe to come. The whole system was a testament to the hubris of optimization. The obsession with shaving 1/10 of a cent off the cost of a component led to a globalized production line thousands of miles long and millimeters deep. A single disruption anywhere along that chain could cause a catastrophic failure. This is the core cause and effect chain that set the stage for disaster. Cause: a relentless corporate drive for maximum quarterly profit. Effect: the universal adoption of hyper-lean, no buffer, just-in-time supply chains. Consequence: the complete erosion of any resilience, leaving the entire system vulnerable to the slightest shock. It was a world perfectly calibrated for success and utterly unprepared for reality. This meta commentary isn't hindsight, it was a known risk that everyone silently agreed to ignore. Experts had warned for years that concentrating the production of the world's most critical component in a handful of factories, mostly in one specific, geopolitically spicy region of the world, might be a bad idea, but the cost savings were just too intoxicating. Why build a redundant, more expensive factory in your own country when you could get it done cheaper and faster overseas? The answer, as always, was money. The pursuit of relentless, short-term efficiency had created a hidden, long-term fragility that was about to be exposed in the most spectacular way possible. The world of 2019 wasn't just on the verge of a health crisis. It was on the verge of a brutal education and the true cost of convenience. The music was about to stop, and almost no one had a chair. And so, the music stopped. The year is 2020. A novel virus goes, well, viral. And the world slams on the brakes with the force of a cartoon character hitting a painted wall. In a matter of weeks, the global ballet of just-in-time logistics has its ankles shattered, borders slam shut, flights are grounded, entire nations are put on house arrest. The initial reaction from the titans of industry and the wizards of Wall Street was a coordinated, sensible panic. They looked at the unfolding chaos and universally predicted one thing: a brutal, landscape-altering global recession. Spending would collapse, demand would crater, companies brace for impact, preparing to lay off workers and slash production as the world economy entered a deep, dark hibernation. It was a perfectly logical prediction, and it was spectacularly, cosmically wrong. They forgot to account for the single most powerful force in the modern universe: human boredom. While the outside economy, restaurants, airlines, concerts, bars, the very concept of going somewhere did indeed vaporize overnight. All of that consumer spending didn't just vanish into the ether. It got redirected, it funneled inward, transforming every home into a desperate, hastily constructed techno-fortress against the terrors of existential dread and unending Zoom calls. The Great Shutdown didn't cause a spending collapse, it triggered the Great Shutdown binge. The world, collectively and simultaneously, decided to upgrade its life support system for the great indoors. Think about it, the offices closed. You don't just need a laptop for remote work. You need a good one. You need a second monitor because your sanity depends on it. You need a webcam that doesn't make you look like a pixelated ghost from 1998. You need a comfortable office chair, a standing desk, a ring light, noise-canceling headphones to block out your screaming children who are also now home from school. The corporate world tried to shove a decade of digital transformation into a single fiscal quarter, and the result was a frantic, global gold rush for home office equipment. Meanwhile, with all external forms of entertainment suddenly illegal, we turned to our screens with religious devotion. Binge watching wasn't a pastime anymore. It was a public health strategy. And that 40-inch TV you bought 5 years ago, it suddenly looked pathetic. You needed a 65-inch 4K old behemoth to properly appreciate the dramatic tension of whatever reality show was trending. And video games, they went from a hobby to an essential service. The Nintendo Switch, a console that was already popular, became an artifact of mythic rarity, spoken of in hushed tones. People were desperate for a digital escape, and the demand for PCs, PlayStations, and Xboxes shot from enthusiastic to a vertical line on a graph. This is the demand side of the equation: a sudden, ravenous, and unprecedented global hunger for every single product with a microchip in it. Now, let's look at the supply side. Cue the chaos. The factories that actually build these magical devices, and more importantly, the hyper-specialized foundries that fabricate the chips inside them, were also shutting down. The virus hit Asia first, grinding production to a halt in the very places the world depended on for its electronics. The intricate, 1,000-mile-long assembly line that we call the supply chain didn't just get a kink in it. It suffered a simultaneous, multi-organ failure. A single lockdown in Malaysia could halt the production of a basic component that was essential for half the world's electronics. A port slowdown in China created a shipping bottleneck that rippled outwards, delaying everything. So, you have this perfect, horrifying storm. Demand for chips is going supernova. The supply of chips is falling off a cliff. It was a spectacular collision. The economic equivalent of an unstoppable force meeting a very, very immovable object. This was the moment the word shortage started to creep into the headlines. First, it was webcams. Then laptops, then graphics cards. Lead times for corporate orders of essential tech started to stretch from a comfortable 4 weeks to an alarming 6 months, then a year, then it became a vague, non-committal shrug emoji. The central, ironic failure was this: the pandemic didn't demand strength from the global supply chain. It demanded flexibility and the just-in-time system. The celebrated hero of modern capitalism was designed for precisely the opposite. It was a rigid, brittle crystalline structure optimized for a single, unchanging purpose. When the world changed overnight, the system didn't bend, it shattered. Let's trace the madness. Cause: a global pandemic forces the entire professional and social world online. Effect: a biblical flood of demand for consumer electronics swamps every retailer and manufacturer on Earth. Consequence: this demand wave slams into a supply chain that has simultaneously been shut down by the very same pandemic, creating a vacuum where silicon wafers used to be. The Great Chip Shortage wasn't born out of a single failure, but a perfect synchronization of two opposing, crisis-fueled shockwaves. It was a beautiful, tragic, and entirely foreseeable disaster. The world had built a system that couldn't handle a surprise party, let alone a once-in-a-century global catastrophe. But while the consumer electronics industry was getting its first taste of this new, painful reality, another, even bigger industry was watching from the sidelines. The colossal, ancient, and deeply confident automotive sector saw the economic storm clouds gathering and decided, with impeccable logic and disastrous consequences, that it knew better. They were about to make a $50 billion mistake. While the world of consumer tech was in a full-blown panic, flailing around in a desperate attempt to meet infinite demand with zero supply, the automotive industry watched with an air of detached, regal confidence. These weren't flighty Silicon Valley startups. These were the 100-year-old Titans, Ford, General Motors, Volkswagen, Toyota. They were the architects of modern manufacturing, the high priests of the assembly line. Their supply chains weren't just chains, they were interwoven, battle-hardened ecosystems forged over decades of ruthless optimization. They looked at the pandemic-fueled chaos of early 2020, saw the global economy grinding to a halt, and made a calm, calculated, and catastrophically wrong decision. Following the sacred gospel of just-in-time, they looked at their plummeting sales forecasts and did the only logical thing. They canceled everything. With the absolute certainty of an industry that moves continents, they picked up the phone and called their semiconductor suppliers, the foundries in Taiwan, South Korea, and China. They didn't just trim their orders for the thousands of microcontrollers and sensors that run a modern car, they vaporized them. Stop the lines, they said. The world is entering a depression. Nobody will be buying cars for at least a year. We'll call you when it's over. Click. They hung up, dusted off their hands, and settled in to weather the storm, confident in their supply chain mastery. This single act was the equivalent of willingly giving up your first-class seat on the last flight out of a disaster zone, because the semiconductor foundries, the companies that actually fabricate the chips, had a very different problem. Their phones were not silent, their phones were melting. On the other line were Apple, Dell, HP, Sony, and Nvidia, all screaming, begging, and throwing obscene amounts of money at them for every last millimeter of silicon wafer capacity. The demand for laptops, game consoles, 5G phones, and data center hardware wasn't just strong. It was a biblical event. So, what does a foundry do? On one hand, you have your old, reliable, but notoriously stingy automotive clients telling you to shut everything down. On the other, you have the entire consumer electronics industry offering you higher margins for newer, more profitable chips. It wasn't even a business decision, it was a reflex. The production capacity that the automakers had so cavalierly abandoned was reallocated in a heartbeat. The complex, billion-dollar machinery at Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company TSMC and its competitors didn't sit idle for a second. The lines were rejiggered, the production schedules rewritten, and the silicon that was once destined to become a brake sensor in a Ford F-150 was now slated to become the processor in a PlayStation 5. Then, the plot twist nobody in Detroit saw coming. The auto industry's recession lasted about 6 weeks. It turned out that when you tell an entire population that public transportation is a rolling petri dish and then hand them stimulus checks, they don't stop buying cars, they buy more cars. People fled cities for the suburbs. The family road trip became the only vacation option. A personal vehicle transformed from a convenience into a piece of personal protective equipment. A private quarantine bubble on wheels. Demand for cars, especially profitable trucks and SUVs, didn't just recover, it snapped back with the force of a tectonic plate. Smiling, the auto executives picked up the phone again. "All right, TSMC, good news," they announced cheerfully. "The apocalypse was canceled. We're back. Fire up those lines. We need our chips, all of them, yesterday." And on the other end of the line, there was a long, awkward silence, followed by the sound of a global industry saying, "Sorry. Who is this? Oh, right, you guys. Listen, we'd love to help, but we're booked, solid, for the next 18 months. Get in line." The line starts in Ohio and ends somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Let's diagram this spectacular, self-inflicted wound, cause, believing they were the most important customer in the world. Automakers canceled their chip orders to align with their flawed recession forecasts. Effect, chip fabs, facing a tidal wave of more profitable orders from the tech sector, immediately gave away the automaker's spot in the production queue. Consequence, when auto demand roared back to life, the car companies found themselves locked out of their own supply chain, unable to source the 50-cent chips required to sell a $50,000 truck. This was a culture clash of epic proportions. The automakers treated chips like any other commodity part, like tires or steel beams. They assumed supply was infinite, and their purchasing power was absolute. They failed to grasp a fundamental truth of the semiconductor industry. Fabrication has insane lead times. You can't just flip a switch. A single chip takes months to create, through hundreds of delicate, hyper-complex steps. Securing production capacity isn't like placing a weekly order for screws. It's a multi-year strategic negotiation. The automakers were playing 1980s hardball while the tech industry was playing a 2025 resource management game. The result was a grimly ironic monument to this failure. All across America, vast parking lots and airfield tarmacs began to fill up with them. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, of brand new, gleaming vehicles, F-150s, Silverados, Explorers fully assembled, painted, with leather seats and panoramic sunroofs. They were perfect in every way but one. They were missing the handful of cheap, essential chips needed to manage their engines, deploy their airbags, or even operate their windows. They sat in silent, sprawling rows under the sun. A multi-hundred-billion-dollar testament to a single, fatal miscalculation. They weren't cars. They were the world's most expensive paperweights. Those vast, silent fields of brand new, half-built trucks were more than just a logistical nightmare for the auto industry. They were a graveyard. They were the gleaming, multi-billion-dollar tombstone for a philosophy that had dominated the world for 40 years. This was the spectacular, undeniable death of just-in-time. The very system designed to be the pinnacle of manufacturing efficiency had just produced the most colossal and public waste in modern corporate history. It turned out that saving a few bucks on warehouse space is a terrible trade-off when it costs you $100 billion in lost revenue. Let's perform a quick autopsy on the body, the core principle of just-in-time. The idea that made CEOs and management consultants swoon was the elimination of slack. Inventory was evil. A warehouse full of spare parts was a sign of sloppy planning, a lazy cost center bleeding money. A truly optimized company should have no fat, no buffer, no safety net. It should be a lean, mean production machine. But here's the thing, in a biological system, that fat is stored energy, that slack is your immune system. By optimizing for a perfect, unchanging world, corporate culture had systematically engineered away its own ability to survive a shock. They had meticulously designed a championship Formula One car that was faster and more efficient than anything on the track, and then a light rain started to fall, and the car immediately spun out and burst into flames. The pandemic wasn't a light rain, it was a Category 5 hurricane, and it revealed the fatal flaw in the automaker's whole approach. Their power, their ability to dictate terms to their suppliers, was entirely dependent on those suppliers being small, replaceable, and desperate for their business. They could bully a seat manufacturer or a tire company into holding all the inventory and bearing all the risk, because there were a dozen other companies who would happily take their place. They tried to pull the same move on the semiconductor industry, but they fundamentally misread the room. They weren't dealing with a small-time parts supplier. They were dealing with the source of the river. The chip foundries weren't just another vendor. They were a utility. They held the keys to the entire 21st century economy, and they knew it. When the automakers arrogantly canceled their orders, the foundries didn't panic. They didn't even flinch. They just turned around and sold that precious production capacity to the tech companies, who were not only desperate for chips but were also willing to pay a premium. The automakers learned a brutal lesson in supply and demand. When the supply of a critical resource is highly constrained, the power doesn't belong to the buyer, it belongs to the seller. This led to the ultimate corporate humiliation. Multi-billion-dollar Goliaths, the pride of nations, were brought to their knees, effectively begging for 50-cent microcontrollers. The absurdity cannot be overstated. A $60,000 luxury SUV, a marvel of modern engineering, with over 100 million lines of code, was rendered an inert lump of metal and glass because it was missing a single cheap commodity chip that manages the power windows. The entire enterprise was being held hostage by a component that cost less than a pack of gum. The value of a semiconductor wasn't its price, it was its availability. And it was not available. This is the central failure of the just too late system. Cause an unwavering corporate devotion to a JIT ideology that mandates zero inventory. Effect: when the global supply chain is disrupted, there is no buffer stock whatsoever, causing production to halt the instant a single component is delayed. Consequence: companies with massive consumer demand and full order books are paralyzed, losing billions of dollars and ceding market share because their hyper-efficient system had a resilience of zero. Remember that beautiful, intricate ballet we talked about? The lead dancer tripped, and the entire cast is now in a 15-car pileup in the orchestra pit. The meta commentary here is a damning indictment of a certain flavor of spreadsheet brain capitalism. The obsession with short-term efficiency and maximizing quarterly shareholder value had created a global system that was profoundly, fundamentally fragile. Resilience, redundancy, and risk management were all things that cost money upfront. They were investments in stability, but in the quarterly report, they just looked like waste. So, for decades, they were systematically stripped out of the system in the name of optimization. It was a global failure of imagination, a victory of accounting over common sense. Everyone was so focused on making the engine run 1% more efficiently that they forgot to install lifeboats on the ship. As the months dragged on and those fields of unfinished cars continued to grow, a horrifying realization began to dawn on executives and government officials alike. This crisis was about more than just a few bad forecasts or a rigid manufacturing philosophy. The question was no longer just why can't we get chips? The question was becoming why does the entire world have to buy its most important resource from one single place? The crisis wasn't just logistical, it was geographical. And as everyone turned their terrified gaze toward a single island in the South China Sea, the chip shortage was about to transform from a painful business problem into a terrifying global security emergency. As the auto industry's self-inflicted wound continued to fester, the rest of the world started asking the right, terrifying questions. The problem wasn't just a philosophy like just in time. It was physics and geography. Where did these silicon brain cells actually come from? Who makes them? The search for that answer led everyone, CEOs, presidents, prime ministers, to stare at a single island on the world map, located in a notoriously complicated neighborhood, Taiwan. And more specifically, to one company, a company most people had never heard of, but which held more influence over the 21st century than any government or army. Behold, the foundry gods, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. To understand the absolute insanity of the situation, you first need to understand what a foundry is. Companies like Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and Qualcomm are brilliant chip designers. They are the architects of the digital world. They dream up and map out the microscopic cities of transistors that power our lives. But they don't actually build them. They don't have the factories. For that, they go to a contractor, a hyper-specialized manufacturing partner called a foundry. And TSMC is not just any foundry, it is the foundry. It is the Michelangelo of silicon, the only entity on Earth with the skill, scale, and secretive technology to build the most complex designs the architects can dream up. Building one of these factories, or fabs, is a monumentally difficult and expensive task. A single new fab costs upwards of $20 billion more than a modern aircraft carrier, and takes years to construct. Inside, you'll find the cleanest rooms on the planet, staffed by robots and technicians in sterile bunny suits, operating multi-million-dollar machines that use extreme ultraviolet EUV light to etch circuits just a few nanometers wide. We're talking about a scale of manufacturing so small and so precise that a single stray particle of dust can ruin a multi-million-dollar batch of chips. The barrier to entry in this business isn't a wall, it's a sheer, unclimbable cliff face made of solid cash and decades of accumulated expertise. This difficulty is why the market has become so concentrated. And here is the statistic that should chill you to the bone. In the total global foundry market, TSMC controls a dominant 50+%. But that's not the scary part. For the most advanced, cutting-edge chips, the ones smaller than 7 nanometers that power Apple's latest iPhones, NVIDIA's AI graphics cards, and the supercomputers that will define the future, TSMC's market share is over 90%. Let that sink in. 90%. The technological future of the entire Western world, and indeed most of the globe, is fabricated inside a handful of buildings, owned by one company located on one earthquake-prone island. That is the subject of intense geopolitical saber rattling from its gigantic authoritarian neighbor. The invisible hand of the free market had, over the course of 3 decades, meticulously guided the world into outsourcing its most critical resource to a single point of failure located in the heart of a global flashpoint. This is the cause and effect chain that elevated a supply crunch into a full-blown security crisis. Cause: the extreme cost and complexity of advanced chip manufacturing led to massive global consolidation. Effect: a single company, TSMC, achieved a near-total monopoly on the production of the world's most essential technology. Consequence: a simple business bottleneck instantly became a catastrophic geopolitical vulnerability, turning the allocation of wafer production slots into a matter of national and international security. TSMC, a famously quiet and engineering-focused company, was suddenly thrust into the unwelcome role of global kingmaker, with every industry on Earth clamoring for its limited production capacity. Its scheduling decisions became front-page news. Who gets the chips? The loyal, high-paying Apple. Its most important customer, the desperate automakers, who were now lobbying the White House to intervene on their behalf. The cloud computing giants like Amazon and Google, who needed servers to keep the internet itself running. Every wafer that went to an iPhone was a wafer that can go to a Ford F-150. TSMC wasn't just managing a backlog. It was inadvertently steering the entire global economy. This entire arrangement is a masterclass in strategic absurdity, the relentless pursuit of economic efficiency. The same logic that gave us the brittle just-in-time system also led the world to this precipice. It was, on paper, efficient to let TSMC handle it all. They were the best and the cheapest. But this logic produced a global system that was optimized for cost and performance, but had the strategic resilience of a Fabergé egg in a mosh pit. The West had effectively offshored its own future, creating what some called a silicon shield for Taiwan. The idea that the world's reliance on TSMC made the island too important to be invaded, but it also created a choke point so severe that a drought, a power outage, or a single political miscalculation could bring the modern world to a screeching halt. With this terrifying realization now sinking in across every corporate boardroom and government situation room, the nature of the crisis began to shift. The problem was no longer just a shortage, it was a panic. The biggest, richest, and most powerful companies on Earth looked at this single, fragile source and came to a rational, selfish, and deeply destructive conclusion: they would not be the ones left standing when the music stopped. The era of polite queuing was over. The era of corporate hoarding was about to begin. With the horrifying realization that the entire world's technological future was balanced on a single Taiwanese pinhead, the corporate atmosphere shifted from polite concern to bare-knuckled, apocalyptic panic. The era of orderly supply chains was over. The era of rational forecasting was a distant, laughable memory. The world's largest and most powerful technology companies looked at the situation, remembered the great toilet paper famine of 2020, and decided to apply that same panicked hoarding logic to their multi-trillion-dollar operations. The corporate hoarding gala had officially begun. What happened next is a classic economic phenomenon known as the bullwhip effect. But let's simplify it. Imagine a group of people in a grocery store. The store manager quietly mentions to an employee that they might get a smaller than usual shipment of bread next week. The employee mentions to a customer that bread supplies are a little tight. That customer, spooked, decides to buy 4 loaves instead of their usual 1. The person behind them sees this, gets nervous, and grabs 6 loaves. The person behind them sees that, assumes the apocalypse is nigh, and clears the entire shelf, piling their cart high with every kind of carb imaginable. By the time the panic hits the stockroom, the store is placing an emergency order for 10 times the normal amount of bread from a bakery that is now utterly bewildered by the sudden, inexplicable demand. Now, replace bread with semiconductors and customers with Fortune 500 companies, and you have the chip crisis of 2021. The biggest names in tech became the world's most sophisticated doomsday preppers. Their new strategy was simple: buy everything now and order more for later. They began double and triple booking capacity, placing identical, massive orders with every foundry that would take their call, intending to cancel the extras if and when the market ever stabilized. They used their mountains of cash to sign long-term, non-cancelable contracts, reserving production slots years into the future for chips they hadn't even designed yet. They were no longer ordering based on their actual, predictable needs. They were ordering based on their deepest, darkest fears. This wave of strategic panic buying completely shattered the market. The foundries like TSMC, who were already struggling to manage real, organic demand, were now drowning in a tsunami of artificial, fear-driven orders. Their order books, the sacred data they used to plan their multi-billion-dollar expansions, became a work of complete fiction. They had no idea what demand was real and what was just corporate hedging. The signal of the market was completely overwhelmed by the noise of the panic. They were trying to fly a 747 in a hurricane using a compass that was spinning wildly in every direction. It created a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of insanity, caused deep-seated fear and uncertainty about future chip availability, fueled by media reports of shortages. Effect: massive corporations abandon their normal procurement cycles and begin hoarding, placing speculative orders for 150% or 200% of their actual needs to build a safety buffer. Consequence: this surge of phantom demand makes the shortage appear exponentially worse than it actually is, which triggers even more panic buying from other companies, which further inflates the phantom demand, sending the entire system into a death spiral of its own creation. This wasn't a supply problem anymore. It was a behavioral psychology problem playing out on a global economic scale. It was a textbook tragedy of the commons. Every individual company was acting in its own perfectly rational self-interest. If you're the CEO of a company, your primary duty is to ensure that your company survives. And in this environment, the most rational action to ensure survival was to hoard chips. But when every company acts on that same rational impulse, the collective result is the complete destruction of the system they all depend on. The invisible hand of the market wasn't gently allocating resources. It was a white-knuckled fist in a smash and grab. And who gets crushed in a stampede? The little guys. While Apple and Amazon were booking fab capacity through 2026, the smaller companies were completely locked out. The brilliant startup with a revolutionary new medical device, sorry, no chips for you. The established manufacturer of smart home appliances can't get the microcontrollers you've been using for a decade. The smaller players didn't have the cash to pay premiums or the market power to demand priority. They were left to starve, unable to build their products, watching as the giants feasted. The hoarding at the very top of the food chain had a predictable and disastrous effect on the bottom. There was nothing left for the average person. This meant that the products they actually wanted, to buy a new graphics card for their gaming PC, a PlayStation 5 for their kids, the latest smartphone, were simply gone. They vanished from shelves, their online stock status permanently reading sold out. This absolute scarcity at the consumer level created a perfect, tantalizing vacuum. And into that vacuum, a new and highly motivated predator, armed with code instead of cash, was about to emerge to exploit the desperation of the masses. The feeding frenzy was about to get personal. The corporate hoarding at the top of the supply chain created a barren wasteland at the bottom. For the average person, the chip shortage wasn't an abstract concept in a business journal. It was the endlessly infuriating sold-out button on every website for every cool new piece of tech. The most sought-after products of the pandemic era, the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series 10, the new NVIDIA and AMD graphics cards, became digital ghosts, rumored to exist but never actually available for purchase. This intense, widespread, and deeply personal scarcity created the perfect hunting ground for an entirely new predator, the scalper bot. And if you tried to buy a console between 2020 and 2022, you were its prey. This wasn't your dad scalping, where a guy buys for extra concert tickets to sell on the street corner. This was industrialized, weaponized, high-frequency scalping, executed by an invisible army of automated software agents. A scalper bot is a script designed to do one thing: buy a product faster than a human being ever could. While you were watching the countdown timer on a webpage, a bot was already plugged into the website's back end, waiting to inject a purchase request the microsecond the item went live. While you were fumbling to type in your credit card security code, a bot had already auto-filled payment and shipping data for 100 different accounts and completed 100 different checkouts. Your frantic F5 key mashing was the equivalent of bringing a plastic spoon to a gunfight with a Terminator. The launch of the PlayStation 5 was the masterclass in this new form of digital organized crime. The scene was the same, repeated over and over. A retailer like Walmart or Best Buy would announce on social media that a limited drop of consoles was happening at 3 p.m. At 2:59, millions of hopeful, desperate humans would be poised at their computers, ready to click. At 3 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds, the Add to Cart button would appear. At 3 hours 0 minutes and 1 second, before the webpage had even finished loading for most people, the button would change to sold out. The entire multi-million-dollar inventory of a national retailer vanished in the blink of an eye. There was no queue. There was no chance. The entire stock had been inhaled by bots. This wasn't the work of a few lone wolf coders. A sophisticated and highly organized ecosystem had sprung up around this practice. Shadowy groups on Discord and Telegram, known as cook groups, became the command centers. For a monthly subscription fee, you could gain access to the most powerful bots on the market, receive real-time alerts about upcoming and unannounced stock drops, and get tutorials on how to operate this digital arsenal. These groups had better market intelligence and faster technology than the multi-billion-dollar retailers they were targeting. They operated like professional trading firms, celebrating their wins by posting screenshots of their successful purchase confirmations for dozens of consoles at a time. A digital middle finger to the millions of regular people they had just beaten. The business model was brutally simple and obscenely profitable. Cause an extreme and prolonged shortage of a product with universal demand, like the PS5, creates a massive gap between its official retail price and what people are actually willing to pay for it. Effect: organized scalping groups use automated bots to purchase nearly the entire available stock at the retail price, say, for $199. Consequence: these units are then immediately listed on secondary marketplaces like eBay and stocks for double, triple, or even quadruple the price, where desperate consumers, completely locked out of the primary market, are forced to pay the ransom. A scalper could invest $5,000 to acquire 10 consoles and flip them for $12,000 a week later. A risk-free profit margin that would make a Wall Street hedge fund blush. This was the ultimate consumer-facing symptom of the entire broken supply chain. It revealed just how vulnerable our modern e-commerce infrastructure really was. The websites of the world's biggest retailers were built for a polite, orderly world where one person buys one thing at a time. They were utterly unprepared for a coordinated, brute force attack from thousands of automated agents simultaneously. Their anti-bot measures, like CAPTCHA puzzles, were a joke, easily bypassed by the sophisticated bots that could solve them faster than a human. And from a certain cynical perspective, the retailers had little incentive to fight back too hard. For them, a sale was a sale. The inventory sold out in seconds, which looked great on their metrics. The headache of consumer rage, brand damage for the console makers, and the inflated secondary market was somebody else's problem. The free market hadn't just been bent out of shape, it had been actively hijacked. Its core mechanisms of price discovery and fair access completely subverted by technology. But behind the cold, emotionless code of the bots were actual people. Thousands of them. They were often young, tech-savvy, and deeply immersed in a culture that saw this not as unethical exploitation, but as a smart side hustle. They called themselves resellers, not scalpers, and they had a whole host of infuriatingly simple, market-based justifications for why they were not the villains of this story. In fact, they believed they were the heroes. If the bot was the weapon, the person wielding it was something new, something terrifying, something that looked a lot like the final boss of capitalism. Meet the modern scalper. They don't call themselves that. Of course, they are resellers, they are flippers, they are entrepreneurs running a side hustle. They are solo capitalists who have perfected the art of being in the right place, online, at the right time, 1,000 times a second, and in the chaos of the great shortage. These individuals, armed with a bot subscription and a dozen credit cards, began making more money than established small businesses, all without creating a single ounce of tangible value for society. Their justifications were a perfect, infuriating cocktail of market worship and cynical deflection. When confronted with the anger of millions of people they'd priced out of a hobby, their defense was always the same. First, the appeal to legality. I'm not doing anything illegal, and technically, they were right. There were no laws against using a bot to buy a video game console. It was a violation of retailers' terms of service, sure, but not a crime. It was exploiting a loophole, not breaking a law. Next came the high-minded appeal to economics. I am simply a middleman, providing liquidity to the market. The real price of a PlayStation 5 isn't for $199. If it was, there wouldn't be a shortage. And finally, the ultimate, unanswerable shrug: don't hate the player, hate the game. This was their mantra. They saw the global supply chain not as a system for getting goods to people, but as a giant, broken video game with exploitable glitches. They were just the expert players who had figured out the cheat codes. If you were mad, it was because you were bad at the game. The most absurd part of this phenomenon was the sheer, frictionless profit of it all. Think of a traditional small business, a restaurant, a bookstore, a coffee shop. It requires a physical location, employees, inventory, insurance, marketing, and a mountain of overhead. It is a high-risk, low-margin, incredibly difficult endeavor. The professional scalper, by contrast, had virtually zero overhead. A bot subscription, a few $100s for proxies to mask their IP address, and access to credit. That was it. From a bedroom, a single person could orchestrate an operation that netted tens, even hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure profit, with none of the risks or responsibilities of a real business. This model was ruthlessly applied to anything and everything that was scarce. The bots, which were originally perfected to scalp limited edition Nike sneakers, were turned loose on a whole new range of products: graphics cards, Pokémon and sports trading cards, which experienced their own insane pandemic bubble. Luxury watches, at its most dystopian. The model was even applied to essentials like baby formula during a shortage. If there was a gap between the retail price and the panic price, the scalper army was there to exploit it. This was a highly technical operation. Cause, the combination of a hustle culture that glorifies any form of profit-seeking with powerful, accessible automation tools. Effect, professional scalpers use a sophisticated toolkit: bots, server monitors, address jigging, and virtual credit cards to systematically bypass one per customer limits and clear out 100% of a retailer's stock. Consequence, the very concept of a fair retail price is annihilated. Consumer trust is vaporized, and the market becomes a two-tiered system, one for the bots, and a second, brutally inflated one for actual human beings. The meta commentary is that this represents the complete financialization of consumer goods. Products were no longer things to be owned or used. They were simply assets to be flipped. The scalper is the logical conclusion of a world where everything is a market and every market can be gamed. They didn't break the rules of capitalism. They followed them to their most extreme, cynical, and antisocial conclusion. They held up a mirror to the system, and the reflection was a grotesque caricature of supply and demand, utterly divorced from human community or fairness. And because they were so visible, so infuriatingly smug, they became the perfect villains. It was easy for the public to channel all their rage at the 22-year-old on eBay, selling a graphics card for the price of a used car. It was cathartic, but it was also a distraction. The scalpers were just jackals, feeding on a carcass. They didn't create the scarcity. They were merely a symptom of a much larger disease. And just when the ecosystem seemed like it couldn't possibly get more toxic, an entirely new species of predator, one with an even more insatiable appetite for the world's silicon, was about to join the hunt. Just when the battlefield of consumer technology seemed crowded enough, with corporate hoarders on one side and an army of scalper bots on the other, a new, even more terrifying combatant entered the arena. This one didn't just want a few thousand units to flip for a profit. This one was infinitely hungry. It wanted every single chip it could find, and it was prepared to pay any price to get them. This was the great crypto mining fire, a digital gold rush of such monumental scale and absurdity that it poured rocket fuel onto the already raging inferno of the chip shortage. To understand this new layer of chaos, you need a very basic, slightly insane explanation of cryptocurrency mining. Imagine there's a global digital lottery happening every 10 minutes. To enter, you have to guess an astronomically large number. The first person or computer to guess the correct number wins the lottery and is rewarded with a handful of freshly minted magic internet coins like Bitcoin or Ethereum. The only way to guess is through brute force, trying trillions of random numbers a second. To do this, you need a very specific kind of engine, one that is exceptionally good at doing thousands of repetitive calculations at the same time. As it turned out, the perfect engine for this task already existed. It was the graphics card. A graphics processing unit, or GPU, the heart of any gaming PC, was designed to render the complex 3D worlds of video games. Its architecture is built for parallel processing, handling thousands of tasks simultaneously. To paint millions of pixels on your screen 60 times a second, this same architecture, by a beautiful and terrible accident of engineering, was also the perfect tool for guessing trillions of numbers. A second to win the crypto lottery, its purpose, overnight, was hijacked. This had been a niche issue for years, but in late 2020 and 2021, two things happened at once. The chip shortage was already strangling the supply of new GPUs, and the price of cryptocurrencies went completely unhinged. Parabolic. This triggered a gold rush of historic proportions. We weren't talking about gamers with a spare PC in their basement anymore. We were talking about industrial-scale mining farms. Pictures emerged of vast warehouses in places with cheap electricity: Siberia, Kazakhstan, rural Texas, filled with nothing but thousands upon thousands of consumer graphics cards stacked on bare metal racks, whirring away under the strain of constant computation. These operations weren't buying one or two cards from Best Buy. They were buying them by the pallet, by the shipping container, often intercepting them directly from distributors before they ever had a chance to reach a retail shelf. So now, the poor, beleaguered PC gamer trying to buy a single graphics card wasn't just competing with scalper bots. They were competing with a multi-billion-dollar global industry that saw that exact same card not as a piece of entertainment hardware, but as a cash flow positive industrial asset. A gamer might be willing to pay a few $100s over retail for their hobby. A crypto miner was willing to pay double or triple the retail price because they had spreadsheets and ROI calculations that justified it. The consumer never stood a chance. Let's follow the chain of madness. Cause: a speculative bubble in cryptocurrency prices makes it fantastically profitable to mine coins using consumer GPUs. Effect: a global, industrial-scale rush to acquire GPUs begins, with mining farms buying every card they can find at virtually any price. Consequence: the already critically low supply of graphics cards is completely annihilated, shutting the intended users, gamers, artists, designers out of the market entirely and making the scalpers' secondary market even more grotesquely inflated. The meta commentary here is a testament to peak technological absurdity. One of the most complex and powerful pieces of consumer hardware ever designed, the culmination of decades of research into computer graphics and parallel computing, was being mass conscripted into a global network dedicated to guessing numbers to generate speculative financial assets, all while consuming more electricity than the entire nation of Argentina. It was a perfect, horrifying nexus of a financial mania, an environmental controversy, and a supply chain disaster. The market was efficiently allocating the scarce supply of GPUs to the highest bidder, but the result felt profoundly, cosmically stupid. But even this epic, world-spanning battle over the sexiest, most powerful chips was, in its own way, a distraction. The fight for GPUs was the headline act, the noisy, flashy drama that caught everyone's attention. The real crisis, the one that was quietly bringing the entire global economy to a standstill, wasn't about these high-performance supercomputers on a card. It was about the boring stuff, the cheap stuff, the tiny, unglamorous chips that the world had forgotten it was even running on, while the world was mesmerized by the high-stakes drama of the graphics card wars and the PlayStation 5 famine. The real, grinding, soul-crushing heart of the chip shortage was happening in the bargain bin. This was the unsexy shortage, the boring shortage, the crisis that wasn't about bleeding-edge 7-nanometer processors, but about the cheap, clunky, and utterly indispensable chips that the world had long since taken for granted. The world obsessed over the Lamborghinis of the silicon world, but the real bottleneck was a global, catastrophic shortage of Toyota Corollas. These are what the industry calls legacy chips or mature nodes. They are not the silicon superstars. They're the grizzled veterans, the character actors of the tech world. Think of chips built on older, larger manufacturing processes: 40 nanometers, 90 nanometers, even chunkier. These aren't the brains of an iPhone. They're the digital equivalent of a light switch, a thermostat, a doorbell. They are microcontrollers, MCUs, power management integrated circuits, PMICs, and display drivers. They are the simple, single-task workhorses that cost pennies to produce, but are stuffed into every single electronic device by the handful. A new car's the perfect example. It might have a couple of very advanced chips running its fancy infotainment screen and self-driving features, but it also has hundreds of these cheap, dumb legacy chips scattered everywhere. There's a tiny microcontroller for each power window. There's one for the seat adjustment motors. There are dozens managing the engine, the transmission, the anti-lock brakes, the airbag deployment sensors. Your ridiculously expensive smart TV has one powerful processor, but it also needs a cheap display driver chip to actually tell the pixels what to do. Your laptop charger needs a power management chip to keep from exploding. These components aren't the stars of the show. They're the stage hands, the roadies, The guys who check the tickets at the door, and without them, there is no show, and it was here, in this dusty, unglamorous corner of the market, that the shortage was most acute. For decades, all the glory, all the investment, and all the profits were in the cutting-edge fabs. Companies like TSMC and Samsung were spending tens of billions of dollars to get from 7 nanometers to 5 nanometers to 3 nanometers because that's what Apple and Nvidia would pay a premium for. Nobody, and I mean nobody, was investing billions to build a shiny new factory just to crank out more 50-cent power management chips from a 15-year-old process. The existing factories that made these things were already old, fully depreciated, and had been running at 100% capacity for years before the pandemic even started. There was no slack in the system to begin with. Now, let's add the automaker's glorious unforced error to the mix. Remember that $50 billion mistake? These were the chips they canceled. When they cut their orders, they severed their connection to this fragile, maxed out, underinvested production line, and when the work-from-home boom created a surge in demand for monitors, webcams, printers, and every other peripheral imaginable, all of which are chock full of these legacy chips. That capacity was immediately swallowed up when the car companies came crawling back. The line was gone. This created an economic paradox of stunning absurdity, cause years of systemic underinvestment in the manufacturing capacity for low-margin, commoditized legacy chips. Effect, when a broad-based demand surge hits, the already strained production capacity for these essential components is immediately overwhelmed, with no new capacity available to bring online. Consequence, the production of immensely valuable and complex products, from cars to industrial machinery, is completely halted by the lack of a single component that costs less than $1, causing a hugely disproportionate economic impact. Ford couldn't sell a $70,000 truck because it couldn't get its hands on a $1 microcontroller. The entire value chain was being held hostage by its cheapest link. The meta commentary here is a powerful critique of our cultural and economic obsession with innovation. At the expense of maintenance, we fetishize the new, we celebrate the next big thing. The faster processor, the thinner phone. We completely ignore the vast, boring, and critically important foundation upon which all that innovation is built. It is like being a city that spends all its money on a spectacular new art museum while the roads, the sewers, and the electrical grid are all crumbling into dust. The great legacy chip shortage was a sign that our technological infrastructure was starting to rot from the bottom up. So here's our situation. The supply chain is a smoking crater. The fancy chips are being hoarded by crypto miners and scalpers. The boring chips that actually run the world have ceased to exist. Automakers have built vast monuments of useless metal. Every company on Earth is panicking. What happens next in any disaster of this magnitude? What happens when the Thanksgiving turkey is burnt, the family vacation is ruined, or the global economy grinds to a halt? The blame game Olympics are about to begin. So, the stage is set for a global economic catastrophe. The intricate, world-spanning machine of production has ground to a halt, paralyzed by a shortage of baked sand. And in the face of this complex, systemic failure, the leaders of industry and government did what any rational, highly paid group of people would do. They formed a circular firing squad and began pointing fingers with the intensity of a toddler who just broke a priceless vase. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Blame Game Olympics, a spectacular international event where everyone is a victim. Everyone is outraged and absolutely nobody is at fault. In Lane 1, we have the automakers competing for the gold medal in righteous indignation, with their factories idle and their parking lots overflowing with unsellable vehicles. They went on a full-blown media and lobbying offensive. Their story was simple and compelling. Those greedy, foreign semiconductor foundries had cut them off. We are the backbone of American industry, they thundered in the halls of Congress. We create millions of jobs. And these chip companies in Asia are prioritizing shiny new phones and frivolous gaming consoles over the essential vehicles that make our country run. This is unfair, it's un-American, and it's a national security crisis. It was a masterful performance, conveniently omitting the tiny, insignificant detail that they had voluntarily canceled all of their own orders. Just a few months prior, in Lane 2, the quiet, formidable team from the foundries, led by their captain, TSMC, their strategy wasn't loud. It was precise and brutally factual. Through terse, carefully worded press releases, they responded, "We are currently running our fabrication plants at over 100% of our stated capacity. We are a contract manufacturer. We build what our customers order. Our automotive clients provided highly erratic forecasts, and then canceled their long-term agreements. We, in turn, reallocated that production capacity to other sectors with stable, predictable, and high-volume demand. We are investing over $100 billion in new facilities, but creating a new fab takes several years. We cannot, unfortunately, materialize silicon wafers out of thin air. It was the corporate equivalent of "per my last email," a devastatingly polite takedown of the automaker's entire narrative. Over in lane 3, the chip designers like Nvidia and AMD, who were simultaneously posting record profits and dealing with a biblical plague of customer rage. Their position was a delicate step. They blamed the foundries upstream. "We have designed the most sought-after products in the world, and demand is overwhelming. We have placed record-breaking orders with our foundry partners, but they simply cannot produce them fast enough." Then, they blamed the retailers and scalpers downstream. "The few products that do make it to market are being instantly stolen by malicious bots and sold at criminal markups. This is a retail and distribution problem that is damaging our brand." It was a masterclass in being caught in the middle and trying to deflect blame in both directions at once. And let's not forget the government officials who suddenly woke up from a 30-year nap to discover that their country's entire economy was dependent on a supply chain they didn't control, located in a place they had sworn to defend. Their blame was, for a moment, directed inward. "How did we let this happen?" they asked in horrified congressional hearings. "Our short-sighted obsession with offshoring has created a critical vulnerability." This flicker of self-awareness quickly morphed into a simpler, more actionable plan: throw money at it. The problem wasn't bad policy. It was just not enough spending. Amidst this chaotic free-for-all, there was one group everyone could agree on. One villainous entity that served as the perfect, universal scapegoat: the scalper. The automakers could blame them. The chip designers could blame them. The retailers could blame them. The average consumer, furious that they couldn't buy a PlayStation, definitely blamed them. The scalper was the visible, hateable, cartoonishly evil face of the crisis. They were the lightning rod that drew the rage of an entire planet, conveniently distracting from the much more complicated, systemic failures that had enabled their rise in the first place. This is the central cause and effect of the blame game. Cause: a deeply interconnected, complex crisis with no single, simple cause creates immense financial and public relations pressure on every actor involved. Effect: each industry group engages in a public campaign of deflecting responsibility, pointing fingers at the greed, incompetence, or malice of others in the supply chain. Consequence: the public discourse descends into a chaotic mess of finger-pointing, making rational conversation about the systemic root causes just-in-time fragility, geographic over-concentration, corporate hoarding nearly impossible, and delaying any real, coordinated solution. It was a global masterclass in avoiding self-reflection. It was far easier for an automaker to blame TSMC than to admit its own forecasting was a disaster. It was easier for a politician to blame China than to admit to decades of flawed industrial policy, and it was easiest for everyone to blame the kid in his basement with a bot. Nobody wanted to confess their shared complicity in building a globalized system, so optimized for profit that it was guaranteed to shatter at the first sign of trouble. But while the circular firing squad was busy reloading, the real-world consequences of their collective failure were starting to spiral into pure economic absurdity. While the titans of industry were busy pointing fingers and assigning blame, the real world was contorting itself into some very strange and painful new shapes. For the average person, the chip shortage wasn't about TSMC's fab capacity, it was about the suddenly empty shelves at Target. And nowhere did this reality become more surreal, more financially mind-bending than at your friendly neighborhood used car lot, because in 2021, the chip shortage broke one of the fundamental, ironclad laws of personal finance, the law of vehicle depreciation. Here is a truth that has been as reliable as gravity for the last century: a new car is a terrible investment. The moment you drive it off the lot, its value plummets by thousands of dollars. It is a depreciating asset, a money pit on wheels, except for a brief and glorious period. It wasn't. Here's how this economic insanity unfolded. First, the new car supply evaporated. Thanks to the automaker's $50 billion blunder, the assembly lines ground to a halt. Dealerships that once had hundreds of new vehicles gleaming on their lots now had a vast sea of empty asphalt with maybe a half-dozen cars and a few lonely, apologetic salespeople. If you wanted to buy a new Ford Bronco or a Toyota RAV4, you were put on a waiting list that stretched for 6 months, a year, sometimes longer. You could order the car, but you couldn't have it. But people still needed cars. Leases were ending. Old beaters were dying, families were growing. All of that desperate, organic demand, which would normally be absorbed by the new car market, was funneled with the force of a fire hose into the used car market. Suddenly, millions of buyers were competing fiercely for a fixed, and even shrinking, supply of pre-owned vehicles. It was a textbook supply and demand shock of epic proportions. Prices didn't just rise, they went to the moon. This led to the central, brain-breaking paradox of the era. For the first time in history, used cars were selling for significantly more than their brand-new counterparts. A one-year-old Toyota Tacoma with 10,000 miles on it was listing for $5,000 above the original MSRP of a new one. People were paying a premium for a vehicle that was objectively worse. It was used. It had wear and tear. Its warranty was shorter. Why? Because you could have it now. The thousands of dollars in markup wasn't for the car. It was a fee you paid for the privilege of immediacy. It was the price of skipping the year-long waiting list. Let's trace this ripple of pure absurdity. Cause: the global chip shortage brings new vehicle production to a near standstill, creating an unprecedented supply vacuum. Effect: an avalanche of consumer demand shifts to the used car market, causing prices to explode by 30, 40, even 50% in a single year. Consequence: the laws of depreciation are inverted, turning used cars into appreciating assets and creating a surreal bubble, where one-year-old vehicles are worth more than their brand-new equivalents. This chaos bled into every adjacent industry. Rental car giants like Hertz and Avis, who normally fuel the used car market by selling off their fleets after a year, suddenly stopped. They held on to their cars for longer, driving up the average age and mileage of a rental. In some cases, they became buyers themselves, competing with regular consumers at wholesale auctions just to have enough cars to operate. Your insurance premiums went up because if your car was totaled, the cost for the insurance company to replace it was now bizarrely higher than what the car was worth a year ago. It was a system-wide breakdown of every norm the auto industry had ever known. This, right here, was the most tangible, kitchen-table consequence of the entire global chip crisis. It was the perfect, painful illustration of how a microscopic component, fabricated on a single island on the other side of the world, could directly warp the financial reality of a family in Des Moines. The value of your pickup truck was no longer being determined by its condition or its mileage. It was being determined by production schedules at a Taiwanese foundry and the logistics of global shipping. The abstract had become brutally, expensively concrete. And as corporate America watched this spontaneous, market-driven chaos unfold, they began to take notes. They saw how a massive, confusing, global crisis could be used to rewrite the rules. They saw how consumers, when desperate enough, would pay more for less. The used car bubble was a bizarre, organic phenomenon, but the lessons it taught were about to be applied intentionally and with ruthless precision. The phrase supply chain issues was about to be weaponized. As the global economy buckled and groaned under the weight of the chip shortage, the corporate world made a profound and powerful discovery. They discovered a magical phrase, a two-word incantation so potent it could justify any price hike, excuse any delay, and absolve any corporate sin. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card for the entire global economy. Those words were supply chain issues. Overnight, this phrase became the universal, no questions asked alibi for literally everything. Your new sofa is 6 months late. Sorry, supply chain issues. The price of chicken wings just doubled? You guessed it, supply chain issues. The new version of a product has fewer features than the old one but costs more. A direct result of ongoing supply chain issues. Customer service hold time is 3 hours. Our apologies, we're experiencing higher than normal call volumes due to, well, you know, it was my dog ate my homework of late-stage capitalism, and it was devastatingly effective. Now, to be fair, was the global supply chain a chaotic, burning dumpster fire? Absolutely. The problems were real. Shipping ports were clogged. Factories were shutting down. Raw material costs were legitimately increasing. The narrator is legally obligated to acknowledge this reality. But a funny thing happened on the way to this global business apocalypse. Corporate profits did just stabilize, they exploded. All across the economy in sector after sector, companies were reporting their best financial quarters in history at the exact same moment. They were on the news, weeping crocodile tears about the unprecedented challenges they faced. This was the dark genius of supply chain issues. It was the perfect smokescreen for a good old-fashioned dose of price gouging. The phenomenon became known as greedflation, and it worked like a charm. The corporate playbook was simple. Step 1. Acknowledge the real, widely reported crisis. Step 2. Raise your prices. not just to cover your own increased costs, but buy an extra 10, 20, or 30% on top of that. Step 3. When anyone asks why, you point to the global dumpster fire and say, "What can we do? It's the supply chain." Consumers, already conditioned by the headlines to expect problems, would just nod sadly and pay up. It was a masterclass in exploiting a crisis. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. You had shipping container companies posting 1,000% profit increases while charging desperate businesses astronomical rates. You had food conglomerates shrinking the size of their packages, while also jacking up the price shrinkflation under the cover of the supply chain. Tech companies, auto companies, you name it. The earnings calls were a surreal spectacle of cognitive dissonance. We faced immense headwinds and logistical challenges this quarter, a CEO would say with a grave face, and as a result, we are proud to announce our highest quarterly profit in the history of human civilization. This magical phrase was also the ultimate alibi for simple incompetence. Was your company's product launch a total mess because of bad planning? Blame the supply chain. Did you fail to hire enough staff to run your warehouses properly? Supply chain. Is your new software buggy and unfinished? We had to rush it out because of, you guessed it, it was the universal scapegoat. The external force that meant no one ever had to take internal responsibility for a failure. Let's follow this chain of cynical opportunism. Cause a genuine and highly public global supply chain crisis. Creates a powerful narrative of universal business hardship. Effect. Corporations exploit this narrative, using it as a bulletproof excuse to implement opportunistic price hikes that far exceed their own. Rising costs. Consequence. Consumers are forced to absorb massive price increases under the false impression that they are unavoidable, leading to record-breaking corporate profits and a massive transfer of wealth from households to shareholders during a time of global crisis. This was, more than anything, a triumph of narrative control. The story that corporations told was, we're all in this together, weathering the same storm. But the reality was that they had found a way to not only survive the storm, but to harness its winds to power their gold-plated superyachts, all while convincing the people drowning in the waves that it was just bad weather. It was a demonstration of the simple, brutal fact that in a crisis, the person who controls the explanation controls the outcome. But this bonanza of excuses and record profits, combined with the very real paralysis of key industries, was finally starting to set off alarm bells in the halls of government. The problem was now too big to ignore, too economically dangerous to leave to the magic of the free market, which had clearly short-circuited. The era of polite excuses was about to collide with the era of panicked, nationalistic, government-funded megaprojects. The politicians were finally awake, and they were arriving with a fire hose full of taxpayer money. The cacophony of corporate excuse-making and the surreal spectacle of the used car bubble finally became loud enough to pierce the soundproofed walls of government. As the crisis dragged on, a slow, dawning horror crept through the halls of power in Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo. This wasn't just an unfortunate market disruption. This wasn't just about gamers or car buyers. This was a five-alarm national security fire. The smooth-brained pursuit of globalization and cost-cutting had led the entire Western world into a state of absolute strategic dependency on a handful of factories on a single, vulnerable island. The wizards of geopolitics suddenly realized the 21st century wasn't going to be one with aircraft carriers alone. It was going to be one with nanometers. And so, driven by a pure, undiluted panic, the governments of the world responded in the only way they know how, by unleashing a biblical flood of taxpayer money. The era of free market platitudes was over. The era of frantic, state-sponsored industrial policy had begun. The flagship of this new interventionist armada was the U.S. Chips and Science Act. It was a legislative bazooka, a $50 billion declaration that America was going to buy its way back into the semiconductor game. The plan was brutally simple: offer monumental government subsidies, a polite word for giant piles of cash, tax breaks, and grants to any company willing to build and operate advanced semiconductor fabs on American soil. It was the policy equivalent of panic buying, but instead of hoarding toilet paper, the government was hoarding multi-billion-dollar factories. The sound you heard in 2022 was the starting gun for the great subsidy race of the 21st century. The response from the industry was immediate. Suddenly, building a fab in the US, which for years had been dismissed as too expensive and inefficient, became the hottest new trend. TSMC, the Taiwanese foundry god, which had been hesitant to expand overseas, announced a colossal $40 billion manufacturing complex in Arizona. Samsung, the South Korean giant, pledged $17 billion for a new state-of-the-art plant in Texas. And Intel, the slumbering American champion, which had lost its manufacturing edge to its Asian rivals, suddenly roared back to life, announcing its own mega fab projects in Ohio and Arizona, fueled by the promise of government largesse. Not to be outdone, the European Union quickly launched its own €43 billion European Chips Act, sparking a frantic, continent-spanning scramble to attract investment. There was just one tiny, hilarious, and deeply frustrating problem with this grand solution: it would do absolutely nothing to solve the current crisis. Building a leading-edge semiconductor fab is one of the most complex construction projects humanity can undertake. It takes years. A site announced with a politician's triumphant photo op in 2020 to might, if everything goes perfectly, begin producing its first test chips in late 2025. It wouldn't reach full-scale, profitable production until 2026 or beyond. This frantic fab-building spree wasn't a fire hose aimed at the existing fire. It was a promise to build a brand new, very expensive, fireproof house on the ashes of the old one, years from now. This is the central, absurd chain of events in the government's response. The chip shortage triggers a full-blown national security panic in Western capitals about their dependence on Asian manufacturing. In a desperate bid to reshore production, governments roll out massive, multi-billion-dollar subsidy packages to lure chipmakers into building domestic fabs. Consequence: a flurry of fab announcements creates the illusion of a solution. But these are all long-term projects that provide zero immediate relief, all while sparking a costly global subsidy war and raising the specter of a massive supply glut 5 years down the road. The meta commentary here is about the violent, screeching U-turn in global economic philosophy. For 40 years, the unassailable gospel, preached from every university and corporate boardroom, was that of free trade, globalization, and market efficiency. Government intervention was bad. Protectionism was stupid. Offshoring was smart. The chip crisis vaporized that entire ideology in less than 24 months. The new consensus, born of pure fear, was that resilience was more important than efficiency. National control was better than global optimization. And the government absolutely should be in the business of picking winners and losers with taxpayer money. There are no free marketeers in a foxhole. And there are definitely no free marketeers in a global chip shortage. This massive injection of government cash and nationalistic fervor added a volatile new element to the crisis. It was no longer just a chaotic scramble between competing corporations. It was now a high-stakes strategic competition between nations, and all that government money came with some very sharp, very political strings attached, aimed squarely at the world's other superpower. The business crisis had become a security crisis, and now the security crisis was about to go full Cold War. All that government money being hurled at the chip crisis wasn't just a friendly stimulus package. It was a declaration of war, a tech war. For years, a tense, low-grade conflict had been simmering between the United States and China over technological dominance. The chip shortage took that simmering rivalry and brought it to a rolling, spectacular boil. The quiet, nerdy party of semiconductor engineering was just crashed by the geopolitical bouncers, and they were here to split the room in half. The global shortage was no longer just about supply and demand. It was now a central battleground in a new Cold War. From the American perspective, the panic was existential. The chip shortage had laid bare a terrifying vulnerability. The US designed the most advanced chips, but it couldn't build them at scale. More frighteningly, China, its primary strategic rival, was desperately trying to catch up, and it was using Western technology to do it. The fear in the Pentagon wasn't just about economic competition. It was about American-designed chips, fabricated in Taiwan on Dutch machinery, ending up in the guidance systems of Chinese hypersonic missiles. The new strategic imperative was simple: do whatever it takes to slow China's progress and cut off their access to the bleeding edge of silicon technology. From China's perspective, this was a transparent attempt to strangle their country's rise. The phrase they used was containment. For decades, they had been the world's factory. But for the most critical component, the semiconductor, they were hopelessly dependent on foreign technology. The chip shortage, and the power it gave companies like TSMC, was a humiliating reminder of this choke point. Beijing saw the American moves not as a defensive measure, but as an act of economic aggression, which only strengthened their resolve to achieve total technological self-sufficiency, pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into a frantic, state-driven effort to build a domestic chip industry from scratch. This is when the US government deployed its most powerful weapon, a tool far more impactful than any subsidy: the export control. Through the Commerce Department's Entity List, the U.S. government effectively weaponized the entire global semiconductor supply chain. The new rule was as audacious as it was devastating. It declared that any company anywhere in the world that used any American technology, be it design software, a piece of manufacturing equipment, or even just a patent, was prohibited from selling certain advanced semiconductors to designated Chinese companies like Huawei. This was a geopolitical bombshell, since virtually every advanced chip on Earth is designed using software from American companies like Cadence and Synopsys and fabricated using equipment from American firms like Applied Materials. This rule gave the U.S. government de facto control over the entire global industry. A Dutch company, ASML, the world's only supplier of the critical EUV machines needed for advanced fabs, was effectively blocked from selling its best gear to China. TSMC, a Taiwanese company, was forced to stop making chips for Huawei, one of its biggest customers. The once seamless global market was now being carved up by government decree. Let's trace the geopolitical escalation. Cause the US-China rivalry intensifies, with both sides viewing semiconductor leadership as critical to national security and economic dominance in the 21st century. Effect: the US imposes sweeping, extraterritorial export controls, weaponizing its dominance in chip design and equipment to cut China off from advanced technology. Consequence: the once globalized semiconductor industry fractures along geopolitical lines, forcing companies to navigate a treacherous tech Cold War and creating even more uncertainty and disruption on top of the existing shortages. The meta commentary here is that the dream of a flat, apolitical, globalized world was officially dead and buried. The long-held belief that economic interdependence would foster peace and cooperation was inverted. That same interdependence was now seen as a weapon waiting to be used. The clean rooms of the chip industry, once a pristine symbol of global collaboration, were now a battleground. Decisions about where to build a factory or who to sell a product were no longer just business calculations. They were fraught political choices with immense strategic consequences. The world was playing a high-stakes game of risk, but instead of little plastic armies, the pieces were billion-dollar fabs and export licenses. This new layer of geopolitical chaos sent shockwaves through every tech company on the planet, forcing them to redraw their supply chain maps and rethink their global strategies. Most were caught completely off guard, scrambling to adapt to a world that was suddenly, violently, splitting in two. But amidst the widespread panic and confusion, one company seemed to be navigating the storm with an almost infuriating, preternatural calm. A company that had always played the game 3 moves ahead of everyone else. It was time to talk about the unbothered, rich cousin of the tech world, Apple. In the midst of this global multi-trillion-dollar street fight, where entire industries were being brought to their knees, and governments were in a state of open panic, one company seemed to be gliding through the chaos with the serene, unbothered calm of a royal yacht sailing through a pirate battle. While everyone else was desperately patching holes in their sinking supply chains, Apple was safely inside its own heavily armed, fully stocked fortress. The great chip shortage was a global catastrophe, but for the unbothered, rich cousin of the tech world, it was just another Tuesday. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't luck, it was the result of a decades-long strategy, a philosophy of supply chain dominance perfected by its coup-turned-CEO, Tim Cook. While the rest of the corporate world was chanting the mantra of just-in-time to minimize inventory and maximize short-term flexibility, Apple was quietly playing a completely different, long-term game of power and control. They weren't just participants in the supply chain, they owned it, commanded it, and bent it to their will. Apple's secret weapon was its sheer, gravitational pull exerting size, combined with a willingness to use its mountain of cash as a strategic tool. For years, Apple has operated on a simple principle: don't just order chips, invest in the capacity to make them. Long before the shortage began, Apple was giving its key suppliers, most notably the foundry god TSMC, billions upon billions of dollars in upfront payments. This money wasn't just to reserve future production slots for the next iPhone, it was often used to help TSMC fund the research and development and the multi-billion-dollar equipment needed for the next generation of manufacturing technology. Apple wasn't just TSMC's biggest customer, they were its biggest patron. So, when the great crunch of 2021 hit and the entire world formed a desperate, panicked line outside TSMC's door, Apple wasn't in that line. Apple was already inside, in the VIP lounge. The production capacity for the advanced 5nm chips needed for the new iPhones had been booked, secured, and largely paid for years in advance. When a desperate automaker called TSMC begging for capacity, the foundry had to say no, because that production time was already owned, lock, stock, and barrel by Apple. It was the corporate equivalent of having a private, reinforced tunnel that led directly into the world's only grocery store during a zombie apocalypse. For other, less specialized components, Apple employed a different but equally brutal strategy: sheer bullying power. They would identify multiple suppliers for a single component, pit them against each other in a ruthless competition for Apple's massive orders, and then lock up the vast majority of the winning supplier's production capacity for themselves, leaving smaller competitors like Samsung or Google to fight over the scraps. The results of this strategy were starkly visible to everyone. Cause Apple leverages its colossal cash reserves and market power to forge long-term, exclusive deals and prepay for years of future production from critical suppliers like TSMC. Effect: this guarantees Apple first priority access to the world's most advanced and constrained semiconductor capacity, effectively insulating it from the worst of the shortage. Consequence: while competitors are forced to delay launches and announce production cuts, Apple successfully launches its flagship iPhone, iPad, and Mac products largely on schedule, capturing huge market share and posting record-shattering profits, all in the middle of a global industrial crisis. The meta commentary here is a brutal lesson in the new reality of globalization. The chip shortage revealed that the concept of a fair, open market for components was a polite fiction in a world of scarcity. The market is a feudal system. Apple is the king. The cloud computing giants like Amazon and Microsoft are the powerful dukes, and everyone else, from the once mighty car companies down to the scrappy hardware startups, are the peasants, hoping to get whatever silicon scraps fall from the king's table. Apple didn't just navigate the crisis better than anyone else. Their strategy actively deepened the crisis for everyone else by sucking all the oxygen out of the room. It was a masterclass in the exercise of raw power. But that same obsession with control, the very thing that made Apple so resilient, had a dark reflection. The company's iron-fisted command over its supply chain was mirrored by its iron-fisted command over its own products. The same philosophy that allowed them to secure every chip they needed also drove them to ensure that only they could decide what happened to those chips after they were sold. And for consumers who believed that owning a product meant they had the right to fix it, this control was about to become a major battleground. Apple's iron-fisted control over its supply chain wasn't just about securing parts from the outside world. It was about maintaining absolute, dictatorial control over those parts forever. And the great chip shortage, with its narrative of global scarcity and desperate times, provided the perfect, once-in-a-generation opportunity for Apple and every other major tech manufacturer to escalate their long and bitter war against a simple, powerful, and to them terrifyingly dangerous idea: the right to repair. The right to repair movement is based on a premise that, until recently, was just called common sense. If you buy a thing, a phone, a tractor, a toaster, you own it, and if you own it, you should be able to fix it yourself or by taking it to a local, independent repair shop. This requires access to the three sacred texts of repair: the replacement parts, the diagnostic tools, and the instruction manuals. For decades, this was how the world worked, but in the world of modern electronics, this idea has become a revolutionary act. For years, corporate giants like Apple have fought tooth and nail to destroy independent repair. Their official line is a polished, reasonable-sounding argument about safety, security, and quality control. You can't trust an independent shop with our complex, finely tuned devices. They might use shoddy parts. They could compromise your data security. For your own protection, you must only come to our authorized, very expensive service centers. The unspoken truth, of course, is that the repair business is an obscenely profitable, multi-billion-dollar revenue stream, and they want to monopolize it. The chip shortage was the excuse they had been dreaming of. It was the perfect, unimpeachable alibi to double down on their anti-repair practices. The key tactic in this war is a nasty little piece of engineering called parts pairing, or serialization. It works like this: critical components in a device, like the screen, the battery, or the camera, are given a unique serial number that is digitally handcuffed to the main logic board. If you, a humble device owner, were to take a genuine brand new Apple screen and swap it onto your iPhone with a cracked screen, the phone would recognize that the serial numbers don't match and would promptly disable key features like Face ID or automatic brightness adjustment. The physical repair is perfect, but the software sabotages it. The only way to revalidate the new part is for an authorized technician to use proprietary cloud-based software to perform a secret digital handshake, blessing the union between the new part and the old phone. Suddenly, the chip shortage became the justification for all of it. With the global supply of chips being so critically constrained, the argument went, we simply cannot risk these precious, genuine components falling into the wrong hands. We must tightly control our inventory to ensure every part is accounted for and properly serialized for your security. It was a brilliant, cynical move, using a real supply crisis to justify a business practice designed for profit and control. Let's trace this opportunistic lockdown. Cause: the global chip shortage creates a legitimate scarcity of electronic components, providing a plausible excuse for restricting access to parts. Effect: manufacturers accelerate the use of anti-repair technologies like parts pairing, claiming it's a necessary measure to manage a constrained supply chain. Consequence: the independent repair industry is strangled, unable to source parts or bypass software locks, forcing consumers into the manufacturer's closed and more expensive repair ecosystems and fundamentally eroding the concept of ownership. This wasn't just an Apple problem. John Deere has been a villain in the right to repair story for years, using software locks to prevent farmers from performing their own maintenance on their multi-$100,000 tractors. A single failed sensor could render a tractor useless, requiring an expensive visit from an authorized dealer during the shortage. Getting even these simple legacy node chips became impossible for independent mechanics, giving Deere an even tighter monopoly. Tesla does it with its cars, so do countless other electronics makers. The meta commentary is that this was a massive, industry-wide power grab, executed under the fog of a global crisis. It was the moment the transition from product ownership to product licensing went into overdrive. You paid $1,000 for your phone, but what you really bought was a revocable license to use a phone-shaped object, under terms and conditions to be dictated and changed at will by the manufacturer. The chip shortage was simply the convenient crisis that allowed them to ram this new reality down our throats. You bought the car, but you didn't buy the right to replace its headlights. It was a compelling story these companies told. The world is out of parts. The supply is critically low, and we're all just doing our best to manage a terrible situation. This narrative of shared hardship and difficult choices made the new repair restriction seem almost reasonable. The only problem, for many of the companies crying the loudest about shortages, it was a carefully constructed and deeply hypocritical lie. So, the official narrative, etched into the public consciousness by an endless barrage of news reports and solemn CEO interviews, was one of desperate, unavoidable scarcity. The world's shelves were bare, the factories were idle, we were all helpless victims of a broken global machine. It was a simple, powerful, and deeply sympathetic story. It was also, for some of the biggest corporate players crying the loudest, a carefully engineered fiction. While they were publicly lamenting the great shortage, they were privately engaging in the great hoarding. This spectacular hypocrisy wasn't uncovered by some daring whistleblower. It was revealed by the driest, most boring documents imaginable: corporate quarterly earnings reports. As the crisis deepened, a handful of sharp-eyed financial analysts started noticing something strange. On the balance sheets of major corporations, the line item for inventory, the value of raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods a company holds wasn't plummeting as you'd expect in a shortage. It was skyrocketing. Companies that were supposedly starving for parts were, according to their own financial statements, sitting on the largest stockpiles in their entire history. Welcome to the great hoarding paradox. It was a cynical, multi-layered strategic game being played behind the smokescreen of the global crisis. The motivations were a potent cocktail of genuine fear and brilliant opportunism. On one hand, it was defensive. After the brutal lesson of 2020, companies abandoned the fragile just-in-time religion and converted to the paranoid new faith of just-in-case. They started building massive buffer stocks of any component they could get their hands on, terrified of being caught empty-handed again. But the real genius was in the offensive strategy. In a world of rampant inflation and scarcity, physical inventory was no longer a costly liability to be minimized. It was an appreciating asset. A chip bought today for $1 would be worth $2 in 3 months. By stockpiling components, a large company could insulate itself from future price hikes. Even better, by sucking up all the available supply, they could starve their smaller, less capitalized competitors, leaving them to wither on the vine. The story they told the world was we can't get parts. But the story they told their shareholders was we have secured our supply and locked out the competition. Car companies and their top-tier suppliers were masters of this game, while publicly idling plants due to a lack of chips. Many were simultaneously accumulating a dragon's hoard of the very semiconductors they claimed they couldn't find. So what explains this disconnect? Part of it was the golden screw problem. A modern car requires thousands of different chips. A company might have successfully stockpiled 999 of them, but if they were missing just one critical $1 component, the golden screw, they couldn't finish the car. This led to vast but incomplete inventories. But the other part was a much more cynical calculation: margin maximization. The shortage gave them the perfect excuse to stop making less profitable products. Why use a precious microcontroller in a $25,000 entry-level sedan when you could put that exact same chip into an $80,000 luxury SUV and make 10 times the profit? They weren't running out of chips. Exactly, they were running out of chips for the cheap stuff nobody in the C-suite wanted to bother making anyway. The shortage became a golden opportunity to cleanse their production lines of low-margin vehicles, forcing consumers up the price ladder. This is the rotten core of the paradox. Cause, in a world of scarcity and inflation, large corporations identify physical inventory as a key strategic and financial asset. Effect, they use their massive purchasing power to aggressively hoard components, creating record-high inventory levels, while simultaneously promoting a public narrative of crippling shortages. Consequence, this behavior exacerbates the real-world shortage for smaller companies while allowing the hoarders to justify massive price increases on the high-margin products they do choose to produce, resulting in an explosion of corporate profits fueled by a crisis they were actively manipulating. It was a level of corporate gaslighting that was, in its own way, a work of art. They were lobbying Congress for subsidies to combat a crisis, while their own balance sheets proved they were masters of navigating and profiting from that very crisis. But while most of the corporate world was playing this cynical game of artificial scarcity and price hikes, two of the biggest names in tech were stuck in a bizarre alternate reality, doing the exact opposite. They were desperately trying to sell their flagship products for far less than they were worth, even if it meant taking a bath on every single unit. In the great corporate casino of the chip shortage, where nearly every other player had figured out how to rig the game in their favor, two of the biggest gamblers at the table were inexplicably losing their shirts on every single hand, while car companies and tech giants were busy hoarding chips and jacking up prices to post-record profit. Sony and Microsoft were trapped in a special kind of economic purgatory, a hilarious and agonizing situation where they were forced to hemorrhage money on every single highly sought-after product they sold. This was the tragic farce of the next-generation console launch. To understand this unique flavor of corporate pain, you have to understand the razor and blades business model that has defined the video game industry for decades. The strategy is simple. You sell the console itself, the razor, at a very slim profit margin, or more often, at a significant loss. You take a financial hit up front to get the machine into as many living rooms as possible. The real money comes later. From selling the blades, you take a 30% cut of every game sold. You charge for online subscription services like PlayStation Plus and Xbox Game Pass, and you sell high-margin accessories. The console is the hook. The ecosystem is where you reel in the cash for the next 7 years. This model is a calculated gamble in the best of times. During the global chip shortage, it became a form of ritual self-immolation. The custom-designed AMD processors at the heart of the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X were being fabricated by TSMC on their state-of-the-art 7nm process, the most expensive and in-demand piece of silicon real estate on planet Earth. As the shortage intensified, the cost of every single component, from that main processor to the RAM to the revolutionary solid-state drives, went through the roof. The carefully planned small loss on each console ballooned into a gaping, bloody wound. And here's the trap: they couldn't just raise the retail price. Sony and Microsoft were locked in a mortal combat for market share. The memory of Sony's disastrously overpriced $599 US PlayStation 3 launch haunted the industry. If Sony had raised the PS5's price to $599 to cover their costs, Microsoft would have happily kept the Xbox at $499 and declared victory in the console war before it even began. So, they were stuck, forced by competitive pressure to honor their launch prices, even as their manufacturing costs spiraled out of control. Now, into this perfect storm of bleeding-edge tech and bleeding balance sheets waltzes our old friend, the scalper, and this is where the situation transcends tragedy and becomes a masterpiece of absurdist theater. Sony, after spending billions on research and development, was selling a PS5 for $499 and likely losing money on the transaction. The retailer, like Best Buy, made a tiny, razor-thin margin. The consumer, the actual fan, got nothing. The scalper, however, would acquire that loss-leading console with a bot and immediately flip it on eBay for $1,200, instantly capturing over $700 in pure, effortless profit. This was the greatest and most infuriating wealth transfer in modern gaming history. Cause, the established console business model compels manufacturers to sell hardware at a loss that is massively amplified by soaring component costs during the chip shortage. Effect, Sony and Microsoft are forced to subsidize every console they sell, effectively losing money on each unit that leaves the factory. Consequence, an army of scalpers captures the entire real market value of the consoles, making hundreds of dollars in pure profit per unit, while the companies that actually designed, built, and marketed the product bear all the cost and all the risk. The meta commentary is that this was a market so fundamentally broken that it had become an engine for rewarding the parasites and punishing the hosts. The manufacturer's suggested retail price had become a collective cultural delusion, a number with no connection to reality. All the value created by thousands of the world's smartest engineers, all the risk taken on by two multi-billion-dollar corporations was being systematically siphoned off by a third party, whose only innovation was a slightly faster checkout script. Sony was, in effect, writing a check for several $100s to every single scalper who managed to snag one of their consoles. It was a perfect, closed loop of economic insanity. The companies were subsidizing the very people who were destroying their launch, infuriating their customers, and profiting from the crisis they were all trapped in. But this darkly comedic spectacle in the world of entertainment was just one of the more visible symptoms of a much deeper contagion. The silicon virus was not contained to the worlds of luxury and leisure. It was spreading, silently and invisibly, into the foundational hardware of our everyday lives. The darkly hilarious spectacle of the console wars and the surreal bubble in the used car market were just the public-facing symptoms of a much deeper, more pervasive sickness. The silicon contagion, which had started as a niche problem for tech nerds and automakers, had escaped quarantine. It was no longer just about the things we wanted, it was now about the things we needed. The shortage began to spread through the arteries of the global economy, paralyzing the most unexpected and critical sectors and revealing in stark, terrifying detail just how deeply embedded these microscopic brains were in the fabric of modern life. The first stop on this tour of systemic failure was your kitchen. Tried to buy a new refrigerator or dishwasher in 2021. Good luck. You were likely quoted a delivery time of 6 to 9 months. Why? Because a modern appliance isn't just a mechanical box anymore. It's a sophisticated piece of electronics. That dishwasher needs a microcontroller to manage its wash cycles and water usage. That smart oven needs a processor and a display driver for its fancy touchscreen. That high-end coffee maker has more computing power than the Apollo moon lander. And all of them ran on the same cheap, legacy node chips that the auto industry was screaming for. The home appliance industry, a sector nobody associated with high tech, suddenly found itself in the same desperate breadline for silicon as everyone else. From the kitchen, the contagion spread to a place where the stakes were infinitely higher, the hospital. This is where the story stops being about inconvenience and starts being about life and death. Medical devices, ventilators, defibrillators, MRI machines, patient monitors, insulin pumps are all complex electronic systems packed with hundreds of specialized, high-reliability semiconductors. The brutal, cosmic irony was that in the middle of a global respiratory pandemic, the world faced a shortage of the very chips needed to build the ventilators that were keeping people alive. Lead times for medical-grade components, which have to undergo far more rigorous testing and certification than consumer chips, stretched from weeks to well over a year. It was a terrifying new vulnerability, a realization that our 21st century healthcare system was just as dependent on the Taiwanese supply chain as our iPhones were, and the chaos didn't stop there. It hit the invisible infrastructure that holds our world together. The companies that build the core networking equipment, the routers, the switches, the servers that literally run the internet face crippling delays, industrial automation, the robots that work in our factories, ground to a halt, power grid management systems, agricultural equipment, even basic construction machinery, everything had a chip in it. And that chip was suddenly made of unobtainium. A $2 million MRI machine was being held hostage by a $2 power management IC. This was the great, painful unveiling, cause over the course of decades, semiconductors had silently and invisibly been integrated into virtually every manufactured product, from the most mundane consumer appliance to the most critical life-saving device. Effect: the global shortage of these components, particularly the cheap and ubiquitous legacy chips, created a catastrophic, cascading bottleneck that affected nearly every sector of the economy simultaneously. Consequence: the crisis manifested for the public not just as a lack of luxury goods, but as a pervasive, system-wide failure, with long delays for essential products, disruptions in critical services, and the palpable sense of a world that was simply out of stock. The meta commentary is that this was the moment the chip shortage ceased to be a business story or a tech story and became a fundamental human story. It was a global, mandatory education in the hidden wiring of our own civilization. We had constructed a world of seamless, push-button convenience without ever once stopping to ask how the buttons actually worked. We were like a fish that had just been forced to discover the concept of water by having it violently taken away. The fragility we had built, the systemic risk we had ignored in our relentless pursuit of efficiency, was no longer a theoretical concept in a white paper. It was here, it was real, and it was hitting absolutely everything. So there we were, trapped in the depths of the worst supply crisis in a generation, a world running on empty. But even as the panic raged and the last refrigerator was sold, the seeds of the next crisis were already being sown in the deserts of Arizona, the plains of Texas, and the fields of Ohio. The frantic, panicked, multi-billion-dollar government-funded spree to build new fabs was underway. The world was trying to solve a problem of scarcity by creating a future of overwhelming abundance. And as the first steel beams of these new megafabs started to rise, a new whisper, a new anxiety, began to circulate through the industry. What in the world were we going to do with all these chips? For 3 long, agonizing years, the global economy had been governed by a single, brutal law. There were not enough chips. Scarcity was the new reality. But in the notoriously cyclical, boom and bust world of semiconductor manufacturing, scarcity is often just a prelude to a much different and in some ways more terrifying problem. As the governments of the world were busy throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at building new factories, a cold, familiar dread began to creep back into the industry. The cure for the great shortage, it was feared, was about to become the great glut. The semiconductor industry has always been a slave to its own vicious cycle. It goes like this. Step 1. The boom. A new technology, the PC, the internet. The smartphone creates a surge in demand for chips. A shortage develops. Prices skyrocket. Chip makers post obscene, record-breaking profits. Step 2. The overinvestment. Everyone, from established giants to optimistic newcomers, sees these insane profits and simultaneously decides to build new multi-billion-dollar fabs to cash in. Step 3. The lag. It takes 2 to 3 years of hideously complex construction to bring a new fab online. During this time, the shortage persists, reinforcing the decision to build. Step 4. The bust. All the new fabs, which were all started at the same time, all come online at roughly the same time. The market is suddenly, catastrophically flooded with an ocean of new chip-making capacity. Supply overwhelms demand, prices plummet, often below the cost of production. The companies that just spent fortunes on new factories are now trapped in a brutal price war, leading to massive losses and bankruptcies. The cycle then resets, awaiting the next boom. The frantic, government-subsidized fab building spree of 2022 was the largest, most expensive overinvestment phase in the history of the planet. It was the mother of all boom cycles. But just as the concrete was being poured for these new silicon cathedrals in Arizona and Ohio, the world that had created the shortage began to rapidly change. The ground was shifting under the industry's feet. First, the great crypto mining fire of 2021 extinguished itself in spectacular fashion. Bitcoin and Ethereum prices crashed, and the profitability of mining with GPS vaporized overnight. Graphics cards that scalpers were flipping for $2,000 were now flooding the used market on eBay for $400 as desperate miners tried to liquidate their assets. The single most voracious source of demand for high-end silicon vanished in a puff of digital smoke. Next, the great pandemic binge came to a screeching halt, with lockdowns ending, rampant inflation eating into household budgets, and the threat of a recession looming. People stopped buying new laptops, monitors, and TVs. The frantic work-from-home upgrade cycle was over. The demand for consumer electronics didn't just soften, it fell off a cliff, and finally, the great corporate hoarding paradox came home to roost. All those companies that had spent 2021 building a dragon-esque hoard of safety stock now found themselves sitting on mountains of expensive inventory that they no longer needed. So what did they do? They picked up the phone and started canceling their future orders from the foundries, just as the automakers had done 2 years earlier. This is the terrifying chain of events that leads to a glut, cause the historic chip shortage, triggers a record-breaking, simultaneous global wave of investment in new manufacturing capacity. Effect: while this new capacity is under construction, the primary drivers of the shortage, crypto, the stay-at-home boom, and corporate hoarding all reverse course, causing demand to collapse. Consequence: the industry is now staring down the barrel of a classic bullwhip effect in reverse. A catastrophic oversupply of chips is set to hit the market at the exact moment that demand has evaporated, threatening to crash prices and destroy the profitability of the very fabs being built to solve the crisis. The meta commentary here is on the market's complete inability to find balance. It's a system with no brakes, only a violently swerving accelerator, the same herd-like panic that fueled the shortage through hoarding was now fueling the coming glut through overinvestment. The market wasn't a wise, self-regulating organism. It was a deeply unstable, but polar system, prone to wild swings between irrational exuberance and abject terror. The industry had spent years praying for rain to end a drought, and was just now realizing that it had inadvertently summoned a biblical, company-drowning flood. After this epic, multi-trillion-dollar journey through the 5 stages of supply chain grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and now acceptance of a new and different kind of doom, you have to ask the big question: after all this chaos, after seeing the hidden wiring of the world exposed, after learning the hard way that our hyper-efficient civilization was built on a foundation of pure unadulterated fragility, did we actually learn a single lasting thing? So, after the fire, the flood, the famine, and the worldwide corporate blame-a-thon, the big question lingers like the smell of smoke. After this multi-trillion-dollar education in the school of hard knocks, did we, as a global civilization, actually learn a single, useful thing? The answer is a profoundly, infuriatingly, and perhaps predictably cynical yes for about 15 minutes. On the surface, it looked like a genuine revolution in thinking. The first and most obvious lesson learned was that the sacred gospel of just-in-time manufacturing was, in fact, a deeply flawed and dangerous ideology. The high priests of efficiency who had preached the religion of zero inventory for 40 years were suddenly silent. The new buzzword echoing through every corporate boardroom was resilience. It was the corporate equivalent of a smoker having a massive heart attack and suddenly discovering the joys of kale and jogging. This new obsession with resilience led to some tangible changes. The just-in-case philosophy, the idea of holding strategic reserves of critical components, went from being a wasteful sin to a prudent necessity. Companies started actively mapping their supply chains beyond their direct suppliers, trying to understand who supplied their suppliers, a level of detail they had previously dismissed as unnecessary. Automakers, humbled and humiliated, finally stopped treating chipmakers like interchangeable screw vendors and started forming the kind of long-term, direct partnerships that Apple had perfected years ago. And of course, the great fab building spree was the ultimate monument to the new lesson of geographic diversification. The idea that you should probably make your most important stuff in more than one politically volatile location was no longer a fringe opinion. It was the foundation of a $100 billion industrial policy. It all sounded wonderful. It sounded like progress. It sounded like we had learned our lesson. But then, the old, familiar, and infinitely powerful siren song started to drift back across the water. The song of quarterly profits, the melody of shareholder value, the relentless beat of hyper-efficiency. Here's the brutal, unchanging reality of the system. While resilience is a lovely thing to talk about in a press release, it is also very, very expensive. Building redundant supply chains costs money. Holding months of buffer inventory costs money. Choosing to source from a brand new, unsubsidized factory in Arizona when a fully depreciated factory in Malaysia is 30% cheaper costs a lot of money. And in a ruthlessly competitive global market, the executive who chooses the expensive resilient path gets a polite pat on the back, while the executive who cuts costs boosts margins and juices the stock price gets a $10 million bonus. Which behavior do you think the system is designed to reward? This is the central tension that ensures the lessons of the crisis will inevitably fade. Cause: the catastrophic failure of the global supply chain forces a temporary, panic-driven reevaluation of corporate and government priorities. Effect: a new consensus around resilience emerges, leading to investments in diversification and buffer stocks. Consequence: however, the underlying and unchanging pressure to maximize short-term profits creates a powerful gravitational pull back towards the old, more efficient and more fragile models, making it likely that the lessons of the crisis will be gradually forgotten as the memory of the pain subsides. The meta-commentary is that the chip crisis revealed a fundamental, perhaps fatal, contradiction at the heart of our economic system. The system requires long-term stability to function, but it relentlessly incentivizes short-term behavior that creates long-term instability. We spent 3 years learning that the foundation of our house was cracked, and our solution was to apply a few coats of expensive, resilience-branded paint and then immediately go back to arguing about the quarterly rent. We haven't changed the fundamental incentive structure, we've just paid a massive, one-time tax for its failure. The corporate world's memory is notoriously, strategically short. The visceral terror of idle factories and zero revenue in 2021 will become a distant case study. In a business school textbook, by 2027, a new generation of managers will rise, armed with spreadsheets that show, in stark, undeniable numbers, that holding 6 months of inventory is inefficient, and the cycle will begin to quietly reset. All of this high-minded talk, all of this geopolitical maneuvering, and all of these multi-billion-dollar investments were ultimately just a prelude to the final, unchanging act of every economic drama. It was time to send the bill, and there was only one person left to send it to. And so, we reached the final, inevitable, and most painful stage of our journey, the part where the bill arrives. After years of global mayhem, the shortages, the hoarding, the scalpers, the blame games, the government panic, the fever finally began to break. Sometime in 2023, the tangled knots of the global supply chain began to loosen. Shipping costs came down from their insane peaks. The new fabs were still years away, but the collapse in consumer demand and the crypto flame out meant that chips were slowly but surely becoming available again. The great shortage started to ease, and the prices for cars, electronics, and appliances that had rocketed into the stratosphere just sort of stayed up there, admiring the view. Welcome to the concept of sticky prices, the consumer's final reward for surviving the crisis. It is one of the most fundamental and infuriating truths of modern economics. Prices go up like a rocket, but they come down like a feather during an emergency. Companies are lightning fast to raise prices, blaming 100 different external factors. But when those factors disappear, they develop a sudden, very convenient case of corporate amnesia. The automotive market was the poster child for this new, permanently expensive reality. As chip supply improved and factories spun back up to full production, the sticker prices on new cars did not magically return to their 2019 levels. Instead, the inflated prices of the crisis became the new baseline. The sub-$20,000 new car, once a staple of the American market, was hunted to extinction. Dealerships, having gotten a taste of record profits by charging thousands in market adjustments over the sticker price, decided they quite liked that business model and fought to make it the new normal. The used car bubble deflated from its most insane peaks, but it didn't pop. It just settled onto a new, much higher plateau. The entire automotive landscape had been permanently priced upwards. It was the same story everywhere you looked. That graphics card that cost $500 before the crisis and peaked at $1,500 on the secondary market didn't go back to $500. It settled at a new normal of $750. The refrigerator that got a 20% supply chain surcharge in 2021 just costs 20% more now. The charge was no longer a temporary emergency measure. It was just part of the price, of course. The corporations had a whole new set of beautifully crafted justifications for this. The primary excuse was the cost of resilience. You wanted us to build a more secure, less fragile supply chain. They said, you wanted us to build factories in America instead of Asia. Well, this is what that costs. This isn't a price hike, it's a resilience tax. It was a brilliant rhetorical judo flip, framing the higher price not as a burden on the consumer, but as a valuable feature they were now paying for. They would also point to higher labor costs and energy prices, all of which were true, but all of which were also convenient cover for the real goal, protecting the fat, juicy profit margins they had discovered during the crisis. They had learned that customers would pay these higher prices if they felt they had no other choice. And that was a lesson they had no intention of unlearning. This is the final, brutal transaction of the entire saga. Cause companies jack up prices during the shortage, citing a perfect storm of increased component costs, shipping fees, and overwhelming demand. Effect, as these pressures begin to ease, the companies discover they can maintain these higher prices and the record profit margins that come with them without a significant drop in sales. Consequence, the temporary, crisis-level pricing becomes the new, permanent status quo, effectively leaving the consumer to pay a perpetual tax for a crisis that is now largely over. The meta commentary here is that a major global crisis is the greatest price resetting opportunity. In modern capitalism, it's a one-way ratchet. The crisis provides the perfect, blame-free justification to raise prices across the board. Once the new price is established and consumers have been psychologically anchored to it, the incentive to lower it is practically zero. The invisible hand is great at pushing prices up, but it seems to have arthritic fingers when it's time to pull them back down. Congratulations, you survived the great chip shortage. As your parting gift, everything is now permanently more expensive. This new, pricier world was also a fundamentally different world. The trauma of the last few years had left deep scars on the global psyche. The old assumptions of a seamless, predictable, and abundant world were gone, replaced by a new, gnawing anxiety. And that anxiety was about to become the driving philosophy for a whole new global arms race. The great chip shortage, as an acute, all-consuming crisis, eventually faded. But the world it left behind was a profoundly different place, haunted by the memory of its own fragility. The old faith was shattered. The core tenets of the last 40 years of globalization, lean manufacturing, offshoring, and the relentless pursuit of efficiency above all else had been exposed as a fool's religion. A new, more paranoid, and vastly more expensive philosophy rose from the ashes. The era of just-in-time was dead. Welcome to the new age of the paranoid stockpile. This wasn't just a minor course correction. It was a fundamental rewiring of the entire global economic nervous system. The new watchword, resilience, became a justification for a behavior that was once considered a cardinal sin, hoarding. But this wasn't the panicked, chaotic hoarding of the crisis. This was organized, strategic, and institutionalized hoarding, adopted as official policy by the world's most powerful corporations and governments. At the corporate level, the just-in-case mentality took root. The chief financial officer, who once would have been fired for having more than 3 weeks of inventory on the books, was now being celebrated for securing a full year's supply of critical microcontrollers. Building massive, strategic reserves of components was no longer a sign of inefficiency. It was a prudent, multi-billion-dollar insurance policy against the next global shock. The cost of carrying all that inventory was simply baked into the new, higher price of the final product, another permanent tax on the consumer. But the truly radical shift happened at the national level. Governments, having been thoroughly traumatized by their own helplessness, began to treat semiconductors as a strategic national asset, on par with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The 20th century was powered by oil, and nations hoarded it accordingly. The 21st century, it was now painfully clear, would be powered by silicon, and a new global arms race had begun. Countries like the United States, Japan, and several European nations started actively planning and funding national stockpiles of chips, strategic reserves of everything, from cutting-edge processors for military AI to the boring legacy chips needed to keep the power grid and the water treatment plants running. The new global motto wasn't efficiency, it was, he who has the most chips when the music stops wins. This new paradigm, born from a desire to create stability, came with its own set of profound and dangerous paradoxes. First, it is wildly expensive. The old system was cheap because it eliminated waste and redundancy. The new system is built entirely on waste and redundancy. All that capital, tied up in all those warehouses full of chips, has a cost that guarantees the permanently higher prices we now all enjoy. Second, the very act of building these stockpiles can create the shortages they are meant to prevent. When every major country and corporation tries to build a one-year buffer stock at the same time, it creates an enormous artificial demand shock, sucking up all available supply and leaving smaller countries and companies completely starved. It is the toilet paper panic of 2020, but executed with geopolitical intentionality and a $100 billion budget. Let's trace the logic of this new world order. Cause: the deep, systemic trauma of the global chip shortage destroys all faith in lean, interconnected supply chains. Effect: in the name of resilience, both corporations and national governments begin to build massive, costly, strategic stockpiles of essential semiconductors. Consequence: a new, expensive, and potentially destabilizing global arms race for chips emerges, institutionalizing higher costs for consumers and creating the conditions for even more violent boom and bust cycles in the future. The meta commentary is that we have fundamentally shifted from a global economic model based, however naively, on trust and mutual benefit to one based on deep mistrust, national self-interest, and a doomsday prepper's mentality, we may have made ourselves safer from the last crisis. But we've done so by creating a more fragmented, more expensive, and more suspicious world that is ripe for the next. 1. We solved the problem of everything being in one basket by giving everyone their own, smaller, more expensive basket, and then starting a global competition to see who can hoard the most eggs. This, then, is the inheritance of the great chip shortage. A world of permanently higher prices, of massive government intervention and subsidy wars, of simmering tech cold wars, and of a paranoid new obsession with national stockpiles. The acute phase of the illness is over, but the chronic conditions it created are now just a permanent part of our lives. The crisis didn't just change the market, it changed the world. And so, we land here, in the strange, quiet aftermath. The frantic, screaming, hair-on-fire crisis is over. The great chip shortage, as a headline-grabbing phenomenon, has receded. But what it left behind is a weird, lingering aftertaste, the feeling you get after a fever breaks, but the room still feels strange and unfamiliar. Products are mostly back on the shelves. You can buy a car. You can even, believe it or not, find a PlayStation 5 at retail price. But nothing is quite the same. The world has been fundamentally, and perhaps permanently, re-priced and rewired. This isn't the end of the crisis, it's just the beginning of the new, weirder, more expensive normal it created. This entire saga was a masterclass in unintended consequences, a global Rube Goldberg machine of failure. It began with a naive, unshakable faith in a hyper-efficient system called just-in-time. A system that worked perfectly until the first day it didn't. That initial fragility was then exploited by a spectacular, $50 billion blunder from the world's most confident automakers, who willingly gave up their place in line at the world's only grocery store. This created a vacuum of scarcity, a vacuum that was gleefully filled by an army of hyper-efficient scalper bots, and the hustle culture capitalists who commanded them, turning every product launch into a digital blood sport. Then, as if the fire wasn't hot enough, a speculative cryptomania poured a tanker truck full of rocket fuel onto the flames, hijacking the world's most advanced graphics cards to guess numbers for magic internet money while we were all distracted by this flashy high-tech drama. The real boring crisis was festering in the background. A shortage of the 50-cent legacy chips that quietly run the entire planet. From our toasters to our traffic lights, the world's governments, waking up from a 30-year nap, looked at the smoking crater of globalization, panicked, and started a multi-hundred-billion-dollar subsidy war to bribe companies into building factories that would be ready years after the fire was out. All the while, the corporations themselves were playing a masterful double game, publicly crying about the crisis while privately hoarding components, jacking up prices, and locking down their products to monopolize repairs, all of which led to the most profitable years in their recorded history. And now we left in the aftermath, a world that has solved the problem of scarcity by institutionalizing paranoia, building national stockpiles like doomsday preppers, and accepting a new permanently higher price tag for everything as a resilience tax. So, did the crisis ever really end, or did it just metastasize, transforming from an acute shortage into a chronic, low-grade condition? The empty shelves are gone, but the system that refilled them is a different beast. It's more fragmented, more nationalistic, more expensive, and infinitely more suspicious than the one we had before. The seamless ballet of global trade has been replaced by a clumsy, hesitant march, where every nation holds its own components close to its chest, eyeing its neighbors with deep suspicion. Let's trace the full, insane arc one last time. Cause: a perfectly imperfect storm of a global pandemic, brittle supply chains, terrible forecasting, and human greed triggers a cascading failure across the entire semiconductor ecosystem. Effect: the world endures a multi-year chaos of scarcity, price gouging, and geopolitical panic, which in turn sparks a massive, reactionary wave of investment in nationalistic, resilient supply chains. Consequence: the global economy eventually stabilizes into a new normal, a permanently altered state characterized by higher consumer prices, a fractured and politicized tech landscape, and a deep-seated paranoia that has replaced the old faith in efficient globalization. The final meta commentary is this: the great chip shortage was never really about chips, it was about us. It was a story about how our complex, interconnected world behaves under pressure. It was a stress test of the global operating system, and the results showed that the system is prone to panic, driven by short-term greed, and possesses the long-term memory of a goldfish. We built a world of breathtaking technological miracles on a foundation of bafflingly stupid assumptions. The system didn't collapse, but it was forced to show its true character. And that character was a panicky, profit-seeking, profoundly fragile mess. The aftertaste isn't just absurd. It's the taste of the 21st century itself, and so we're left with a world that's technically more resilient but feels infinitely more precarious, proving once again that the only thing more expensive than a global crisis is the series of terrible solutions we invent to solve it. Now, a friendly and legally mandated reminder: do not use this podcast as the basis for your PhD thesis, your stock portfolio, or your personal philosophy on supply chain ethics. This was a highly dramatic, heavily caffeinated oversimplification of a mess so complex it makes your average streaming service user agreement look like a children's book. We're here for clarity and catharsis, not for certified financial advice. Seriously, if there's another modern, absurdly complicated mess you'd like to see get the fact check, simplified treatment, drop a comment below. We thrive on your suggestions and your collective frustration with the modern world. And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't trust the algorithm.